Welcome to the Trigger Warning Talk podcast, where we have uncensored conversations, we exchange information, and we provide resources for all the listeners and the viewers of this podcast, because we are streaming not only on all the major podcast platforms, you can also watch these interviews. As I always tell people, you got to watch these interviews because you miss some of the stuff that I pull up on the screen here. And some of it is educational, some of it is informational, but it's always in all good natured fun, even though we talk about trauma. So we are streaming also on Spotify as well as our YouTube channel, which is Penton Pending Consulting Solutions, LLC. I'm your fire medic co-CEO, LP. Got a very special guest back in the building for part 2, Dr. Maiysha Clairborne, MD. I'm not going to even go, like I say, I'm not going to go through your whole CV, Dr. Maiysha. It's too long. You're a doctor, you're an MD, you're a master coach, hypnotherapist, NLP trainer, you're a TEDx speaker. Look, we already talked about that. We're working on that. Rapid transformation specialist. You know, you do trauma responsive communication training and emotional learning for parents and educators and healthcare professionals like your brother LP. Mind remapping. You got a coach certification program. You just do so much, Dr. Maiysha. Again, we just don't have time. Like, we can spend a whole hour just talking about everything that you have done professionally. We'll do that at a later time. We're going to jump into part 2 of our ongoing series, where we're talking about primary, secondary, and vicarious traumas. But first, let me give the disclaimers. This is the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. We're sponsored by Spotify for podcasters. We're presented by my company, Pending Consulting Solutions, LLC. If you're triggered at any point during this podcast and you need immediate help, call 911 in your area here in the United States. You can call 143 over in the UK, 112 in places in Europe like Switzerland, or whatever your local 911 type phone number is in the world, because this is a worldwide audience that we talk with. If you don't have an immediate need, but you need help with trafficking, domestic violence, sexually based offenses, you have a true crime issue or story you'd like to talk about or need information on, we provide links and resources for everyone. And we also do a missing person case at the end of every episode. If you need help with suicidal ideation or know about a suicidal issue, call 988 here in the States, toll free 24/7. Also, we provide the numbers and websites for AANA and Al-Anon for substance abuse and alcohol-related issues. Dr. Maiysha,
LP.
We talked last time about primary traumas, specifically about your history dealing with those things. And we talked about secondary and vicarious traumas as it related to your story. Today, in part 2, we're going to focus on secondary traumas specifically and how to overcome those things. And you know, as I always say, Dr. Maiysha, it's my podcast, but it's the guest interview. You're going to be leading the charge here. I'm just going to be behind the scenes pushing buttons. You're a podcaster. You know how we are as podcasters. Sometimes we get in that producer mode and kind of take over. So I'm just going to let you do your thing. The mic is yours.
Well, first of all, before I get started, I want to thank you for, of course, having me back. You know, I love having conversations with you. Also, you are one to talk about this hour-long conversation about things that have been accomplished, because I just interviewed you on my podcast, the Black Mind Garden podcast. And yes, when you told your story and all of the ways that you have contributed up to this point and contribute to the world in what you do, as an educator, as an advocate, as a podcaster, as a speaker, as a trainer. I mean, come on, like your docket is just as long, if not longer, than mine. So I have to give you your flowers right now on your podcast. And just as much as you love to acknowledge Black women, I love to acknowledge Black men. So I'm throwing the flowers. Of those of you who are watching on YouTube, you can see me throwing the flower emoji.
We're like Come to America where they were throwing all the flowers down as the prince and the king will be walking around. That's all we're doing. We're just
That's what
showering
we're
each other.
doing. Just throw the flowers. Just throw the flowers. We have to acknowledge each other in our community, because we have endured so much trauma, so much shaming, so much diminishment, so much dehumanization, that we must be the lifter, the uplifter of each other, every single day. And what an interesting day it is for me to be doing this podcast, because I contract, I do some consulting in equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-racism, and anti-oppression as part of my work. And we contract with a local nonprofit organization here. And one of the things we were doing was scouting. We're scouting to take the executive leader team to the Museum of Human Rights, Civil and Human Rights here in Atlanta, and just going through that museum. And strangely enough, as long as I've lived in Atlanta, I had not yet been to that museum. So it was my first experience, and going through it was, I know we're talking a little bit, we're talking more about secondary trauma, but the vicarious trauma that the activation that I experienced inside of that, I thought, wow, what an interesting day to be doing this podcast and coming back and talking about trauma. Right.
Yeah. We just want to jump right into it because you and your expertise as a medical doctor, it just makes me feel so honored to have someone with your credentials and your experience talk about this. First of all, let's get rid of the stigmas and taboos and the stereotypes and the misconceptions about secondary trauma. We're going to define it first. No, not we. You're going to define it first. And you're going to get rid of all the misconceptions and the stigmas and taboos and stereotypes. I'm just playing producer. I'm just pushing buttons and all that stuff. The mic is yours.
It's a conversation. So to sort of like, we talked a little bit about primary trauma. I want to kind of, I'm a big picture person, so I like to bring the big picture back. And when we think about trauma, a lot of times we think about these sort of major events, right? And then we think of also the event itself as trauma, right? So when we think about trauma, there's two buckets of trauma. There's the direct trauma, and then there's indirect trauma. And then the breakdown under indirect trauma is secondary and vicarious trauma. So in direct trauma, it is that primary. It's the person experiencing the trauma themselves. And so just to backtrack a little bit, if you hadn't listened to the previous episode, please go back and listen to it.
Yes.
You'll learn a lot about me, but you'll also learn a bit about primary trauma. So when we think about this idea of trauma, people think, oh, it's an event like 9/11 or like the shootings that happen, like car accidents, like people think of those as traumatic events. They are events that can cause trauma, but trauma is not the event itself. So trauma is what happens inside of the body as a result of what happens to you, right? So it's what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. And it's actually useful to say up front as we talk about, defining trauma, that trauma to one person, what occurs as trauma to one person may not occur as trauma to another person. So everybody experiences trauma in different ways according to their own background. If you listen, when you go and you listen to the TEDx talks, I'm just going to say, if you haven't listened to it, you're going to go listen to it. I talk about how we process information. I talk about how our brains and our bodies process information, and how we process this information is really based on our upbringing, our past experience. And I call those the filters of our lived experience. And so, how one experiences direct or indirect trauma is really according to what they've been exposed to. So I think it's useful to bring that into the conversation early as we talk about what what trauma is. So when we talk about, that direct experience of trauma, something happens to a person. It could be one big thing, one big intensity thing that happens directly to the person, or it could be multiple repeated events that happen to a person. And then that inside of that, those multiple repeated events of stress, those multiple repeated intense stressors, there's no reprieve. There is a sort of a sense of alteration of safety. It's sort of a feeling of it being inescapable, and it causes something to happen to the body, and that can cause trauma. Now, when we start to talk about the indirect trauma, these very same things happen inside the body. It's just that the trauma is not direct to the person, but is experienced from a different point of view. All right, so it's experienced either from a bystander, from a witness, from a caregiver experience. It is experienced from storytelling. So as I talked about walking through the Museum of Civil Rights and Human Rights today, there's this experience of seeing these things, these horrible things that have happened, and these injustices and this violence that happened, that is a form of, or that can, for some people, incite the experience of trauma. And the level that people experience it is different based on their own capacity or resilience. So with secondary trauma, we're talking about caretaker trauma or first responder trauma. These secondary trauma happens when you are up close and personal taking care of a person who's directly experienced trauma. So a good example would be, we can talk about it from the caregiver standpoint, someone who may have experienced taking care of a person with either a mental illness, someone who experienced taking care of someone with a terminal illness. People don't think of those things as trauma, but these are some of the, we talk about either one big event or multiple repetitive events, right? This is the multiple repetitive event over time. Watching someone you care about or you love suffer or transition is traumatic for the person who is caregiving, right? So it's important to understand this aspect. And then on the flip side of it, the first responder. So when you do have a big event, the people who are first on the scene, who are direct and close contact with people who have directly experienced a violent critical event. As you look, picking up the language, LP, I'm picking up the language. These people experience trauma from a different perspective. So when we talk about, primary, secondary, vicarious trauma, all we're talking about is trauma experienced from different perspectives. And when I talk about the experience of different perspectives in the way of, for my TED Talk, I talk about listening perspectives. We could sort of map this on, like position number one would be like looking through your own eyes, looking through the eyes of the person who actually experienced the trauma. This would be a position number two, a person who is like right next to the person. And I think sometimes the person who is experiencing the secondary trauma often doesn't realize that they're experiencing trauma, right? Especially if they're in the caretaker position. So I'll tell a story that I may have told actually last episode, but I'll tell it again from this vantage point. So I shared in the last episode that I grew up in a home witnessing domestic abuse, domestic violence. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I was told, that I recognized that I was a trauma survivor. So now, while I wasn't necessarily a caretaker of my mom, but I was in the household, witnessing it day to day. Growing up, in my mind, my mom was, a trauma survivor, direct experience. And because the experience of physical harm was not direct to me, I did not have it in my brain that I was experiencing the trauma until I learned later on the distinction, right?
Right.
So it's, if you're listening out there, and you might have a light bulb pop on, you might have an aha moment as to, wow, I did take care of my sick mom or my sick dad or my sick brother or my sick sister. I did take care of, a son or a daughter, or a child, or a sibling who was mentally ill, or I did have to manage someone's affairs on a constant basis, like that kind of trauma, secondary trauma. Or I was taking care of someone who was in a bad accident, or I was, these are some of the things that we don't always experience as trauma for ourselves, and yet we have this internal emotional reaction, a trauma response, when things that happen that remind us of those things happen to us. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
And so I think that's where I'll pause, because I think it's a good place to kind of to converse.
You are such a producer. OMG. You know what? You just make life and work so fun and so easy, Dr. Maiysha. But I digress. We talk about human and sex trafficking, domestic violence, sexual based offenses, and we cover true crime.
Mm-hmm.
And as I always say, we do a missing person case at the end. We're going to cover two cases today, a brother and a sister who are missing from the state of California at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Maiysha, you beautifully blended domestic violence with, I want to throw it under true crime.
Mm-hmm.
From the perspective of first responders, because we respond to a lot of cases or situations, calls that turn into true crime or started off as maybe a domestic violence issue. Somebody attacked somebody else. And when it comes to trauma, anybody can get it, anybody can give it. So we're not, gender be damned. We don't fucking play on this, and we use real language on this podcast. So feel free to talk as an adult, Dr. Mike.
I got you.
This is our TED Talk.
That's right.
I don't know if they allow that on big stage, but here we go. So, as a first responder, as a physician, as I told you before, the technical term for a paramedic is physician surrogate. Mm-hmm. So, from the physician surrogate to the physician, let's talk about first responders. Specifically under true crime, we're going to talk about mass casualty incidents and secondary trauma. What say you to first responders, or what have you said to first responders that you've encountered when you were active in the ED or the emergency department about some of these incidents? And or if you have not had that communication with them at that location from either a TED Talk or some other venue, virtually or in person, what is that conversation like from your perspective?
Yeah. So I'll clear it up and say I'm a family doc, so I haven't been in the ED in a very long time. Since I was in residency, and I opted out of the ED because of that, because that was both direct and indirect trauma for me. So let's just clear that up. What I often say to, and I say this to physicians and physician surrogates, is we have to, one of the things that we sort of develop in this industry is a sort of resilience to bounce back, because you can't exist in job and not develop that resilience. And there's a fine line between developing resilience and shutting down, and completely shutting out, because we do, there is the resilience, but we do need to acknowledge the experience, that experience does have an impact over time.
Let me stop you right there. I
Mhm.
need you to break those two down.
What did I just say? Resilience and shutting out and shutting down. Okay. Sometimes I'm so at the moment of like, what do I need to break down exactly?
I
So, yeah.
want you to deep dive into those two things, especially because we're talking about mass casualty incidents, specifically referring to first responders. But I'm going to add to that in a moment. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So, and what I'll say, anything that I talk about with regard to first responders can apply to anyone who's experienced multiple repetitive of traumas, and that's so first responders, ER doctors, family doctors, oncologists who go in to patient after patient, telling them a diagnosis, surgeons, anyone, trauma surgeons, particularly the people who, police officers, firefighters, all of the people who are experiencing these like ongoing repetitive traumas. So the resilience is the ability to sort of bounce back, to bounce back after something, a stressor or something intense has happened. It's an expansion of our inner strength. Really, it's just the ability to kind of like experience something and then sort of bounce back. I'm pulling the words in my head here.
I'm not making you do math, so don't even look like that.
The distinction, the fine line, it happens, and I'm going to say this because there's this experience in healthcare where this term resilience is weaponized against healthcare professionals, like you need more resilience. But really what's happening is they're inflicting more trauma.
Yes.
And so resilience helps us to bounce back, but it doesn't take away the impact of the trauma that we experience, right? One of the things I think that helps to develop resilience is having the support that's necessary to be able to process the things that happen that can become trauma, the toxic stresses, the multiple repetitive stresses. So in order for us to continue to develop and expand resilience, we must have the support necessary to process the stressors and the intensities and the horrors that we experience inside of these various events, in order for us to be able to bounce back. Where resilience, so let me just say, where toxic stress or ongoing stress turns into trauma rather than resilience, right? So there's positive stress, and then there's uncomfortable stress, which can turn into resilience if the proper support is given. But if the proper support is not given, it turns into toxic stress and trauma. And that is the distinction between resilience and trauma, is where is the support. So for those people who are in positions where you're constantly being exposed to trauma, or to violence, to injustice, to mass casualty, to domestic abuse, to missing persons, to all of these types of things that are happening in the world that can cause trauma, these repetitive stressors. If you don't have a support system, where it be inside of the organization that you work for, like even nonprofit, executive directors, people who are out there really helping, like foots on the ground, helping homelessness, all of those things, right? Human rights activists. If you don't have the proper support systems, be it a therapist, be it organizational, be it whatever the case may be, then that can lead into toxic stress, which can lead into trauma. And a lot of times I think that first responders and healthcare professionals don't feel it because it's like putting what they say about putting a frog in water, boiling water versus putting the frog in water and turning up the heat slowly. Like that is what's happened with healthcare professionals and first responders, is that we're trained from the beginning to withstand a certain amount of stress. And over time, that stress is sort of like packed on. We're not trained to have the support. And so the water is like steadily being turned up, which represents the absence of support, but steadily being turned up. And one day we find ourselves like, what is going on with us? Why are we so burned out? Why are we crying in the car and the parking deck? Why are we, why are we wanting to, take our own lives, jump off buildings? This is, a lot of physicians are doing this, right?
Yes.
Why is this happening? Like suddenly, it seems like it's suddenly, but it's not suddenly. It's the water, the heat in the water has been turned up over time. And because of the training of these first responders, police officers, whatever the case may be, where that support is not readily given. We're not taught to seek that support, or we're not taught to even ask for or need that support. We're not taught to need that support, right? We find ourselves years later in this position of being traumatized and not even realizing it until it's too late.
Dr. Maiysha, I got a great question for you that I just thought about, but put a pin in it. I want to get back to the first responders specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of MCI, mass casualty incidents,
mm-hmm.
and for those that don't understand that term, it's when an incident happens, a violent critical incident happens where 3 or more people are hurt because you need more resources.
Mm-hmm.
And so a mass casualty incident will be called for that. So basically, everybody and their mom is going to show up for a MCI incident. Police, fire, EMS, and whomever else, what other resources. We may even call medical doctors on the scene if there is somebody that's trapped, like 9/11, where the Trade Center buildings collapsed. They had MDs on the scene just in case they had to do field amputations to get people out that were trapped under the rubble.
Right.
So I want to ask you about, since we're talking about secondary trauma with first responders, critical incident stress debrief or critical incident stress management. What work have you done with first responders in regards to secondary trauma and critical incident stress debriefing? And basically what that is, for those that don't know, is after a mass casualty incident happens, because we as first responders are human beings also. This is flesh and blood. We're not one-cell amoebas. We're not cyborgs. We're not robots. We go through these traumas. Now, we're professional as possible, but you know what? Again, at the end of the day, I'm just a person. Take Uvalde, the situation where those children were shot and killed. Dr. Maiysha, and pardon me if I have a moment.
Mm-hmm.
I think about all of those first responders, specifically the EMS personnel.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you why I'm focusing on them. They had to go in and do something that typically is not taught in EMS. They had to go in and get blood samples for those children that were killed. You know why? Because their bodies were so disfigured from the firearms, from the rounds that penetrated them, that they were unidentifiable just by viewing them.
Wow.
They had to go in and get blood samples of each of those babies. We don't get trained in medic school on doing that.
Right.
We don't get trained in continuing education units on, hey, today we're going to teach you how to take blood samples for kids or individuals that might be severely damaged in MCI.
Right.
So imagine having to do that for the very first time in your career, let alone dealing with this MCI with these little kids. who are totally disfigured. The mic is yours.
Yeah. I think in these cases, this is where it's critical for organizations to provide very specific psychological counseling support for these people.
And let me add to that, because I didn't finish. Like I said, I just needed a moment. Critical incident stress management or debriefing is where once an incident like that happens, there is help available immediately for any and all first responders, depending on the level of the need. If you need help immediately, you can get it right there. If you have to be taken off the next call, if you got to go home, if you need to go talk to somebody, help is there immediately or within 24 hours or 72 hours. So that's how it works. And typically is encouraged, professionally it's encouraged, but realistically, because the job involves trauma on a regular basis, and depending on where you work, if you work in an urban or suburban or rural environment, you're not going to see as many traumas in maybe a suburban environment as you do. You won't see as many traumas in a rural environment like you would in a suburban environment. And suffice it to say, same thing, you're not going to see as many traumas in the suburban environment as you are in an urban environment. For example, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, born and raised. That's where I work and practice. St. Louis is the murder capital of the U.S. It's in the top 3 because they fluctuate. So I saw a lot of traumas all the time, every day, every shift. Fire department also. So somebody that works in a rural environment, they're not going to see those things. So you're not going to have the need for CISD as much. Now, when an incident happens, they'll come and talk to every first responder on the scene. How are you doing? You need a moment. What do you need? Here's where the problem comes in, because there's an inherent risk of encountering traumas on a regular basis from call to call, especially if you come from a place like St. Louis, working in that type of environment. It's almost impossible to say, you know what, I need help, because every call can be, if you work a 12-hour shift in St. Louis City EMS, you might do 12 calls, and 10 of them might be shootings or some violent critical incident where people were dead and dying. Well, if you can't handle that, and the average time for EMS, a medic in St. Louis City EMS is 2 years. That's the burnout rate. 2 years.
Makes sense.
2 years. They do 90,000 calls a year on average with 13 ambulances. The mic is yours.
Yeah, I think that, these things, to go and to ask someone, hey, do you need a moment or do you need help, especially to a person who regularly encounters this, and also when there is a stigma inside of the healthcare in general, healthcare organizations, healthcare professionals, of needing help, being weak, it's not the most trauma-informed way to approach it. I think that organizations, healthcare organizations managing these types of things need to have it be mandatory, that there be at least 6 sessions, right? Mandatory EAP consultation for. And maybe, like, because of the high level of trauma, an annual mandatory EAP check-in, 6 sessions a year. I mean, to check in, it gives you, even if it's once a month check-in, and maybe more, an additional, if there's a mass casualty, like something like Uvalde, something like 9/11, there needs to be an additional mandatory, time of counseling and processing, but not to ask, do you need, because you ask and people are in front of their colleagues, they
say no, I'm good.
no, I'm good. Or even in that moment, they may think they're good because maybe this is like the shock moment, right? And the admission of not being good may not even happen until days, weeks later, because people process differently, right? And people process intellectually. Oh, well, I deal with this all the time, so I should be good. So there's lots of different things that happen in a person's brain, that will convince them that they're okay and that they don't need help. But when it's mandatory and you're sitting in that room, then it allows for these things to be processed.
Dr. Maiysha, I'm going to tell you a quick story. One of my fire medic brothers who worked at the fire department with me, he had a call one time. It was a black woman who was hit and killed in a hit and run accident. She was crossing the intersection. This idiot was flying down the fucking street and didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't swerve, ran into this woman, hit her so hard, knocked her out of her shoes. And I remember when I got to the ER, I had a whole nother patient. He was sitting in the EMS room by himself. And I had heard about the call because, you know, like we can look at certain calls over the smart devices or whatever. So I had heard about the call because it was all over the news. And it was all over the local news. And I remember going into the ER at the Level 1 Trauma Center in St. Louis, one of them. And he was sitting in the EMS room. And so I just go in there and I say, hey, man, what's going on? You know, I'm just checking on you. How you doing? He's like, I ain't fucking good right now, bro. I just need a minute. I said, okay, I'm right here, man. I left out of the room. I closed the door and let him do his thing, you know. He came out about 6-7 minutes later. You know, he was composed and all this stuff. And it was like, yeah, I think I'll be all right. I just needed a minute. Thanks, bro. Say, just hit me up whenever, man. I'm right here. You know, and it's conversations like that that you will have more. And I'm not his supervisor. I'm not his boss. I'm not his commanding officer or whatever. You know, we're on the same level, you know. And so when you have these discussions with other first responders, like you said, we're not trauma informed in terms of how to deal with trauma. We just know how to deal with traumas in terms of somebody's bleeding, stop the bleed. Something's broken, splint it. Somebody's unresponsive, start doing chest compressions. They low blood sugar, give them, you know, D5 or glucagon or glucose, you know, whatever. So we know about those things, but the mental health aspect, we don't get enough training on it. I'm so glad that you're saying what you're saying because it all goes back. Everything starts here. It's the mental health component that the secondary trauma when it comes to first responders, we don't get enough of. And that's part of why I started my company to talk to other first responders to say, we call them the white shirts. The chiefs and the whether it's the chief paramedics or the fire chiefs or the bat chiefs or the lieutenants or the captains, we want to have more training because we don't have a problem with getting because we're always getting trained, but we don't always get trained on everything that we need to get more training on. So when the term defund the police came out, I said that's going to be looked at wrong. I don't believe that we should take money away from the whole department. I believe that whatever money is budgeted for that department, police, sheriffs, whatever law enforcement entity, take some of that budget and apply more of it to mental health services. Because we had, in my fire district, we had crisis intervention trained police officers on duty all the time. All the time. And anytime there was a mental health issue, somebody wilding the fuck out or whatever it was, they always had a CIT officer that would show up to help me do an assessment and de-escalate. And I'm telling you, it was night and day. Never did I see an officer pull their weapon, pull the Thomas A. Swift electric rifle, better known as taser. I got to know these terms. Then pull out their AR-15, which doesn't stand for automatic rifle. It stands for the company name that created it. You know, so they didn't put out pepper spray and none of that stuff. You have to have the trained individuals to show up. And that's why there's a bigger push for law enforcement to have more mental health training. Same thing for EMS and fire. Dr. Mike, I want to talk about this stress to trauma continuum. that you mentioned to me, because I had never heard of that. And we're going to wrap up talking about the end of life continuum. So let's talk about the stress and trauma continuum. What is that?
So the stress, I mean, it's the stress to trauma continuum is a sort of a spectrum of how we experience stress, right? So you have positive stress, and that positive stress, it helps us to grow, right? Positive stress would be something like, engagement to getting married, or, positive stress is maybe having a baby. I'm a mom, so that's a positive stress. Positive stress.
Well, I'm glad,
there are aspects of parenthood that are positive stress, right?
Mm-hmm.
First day of school, getting prepared for the first day of school, or whatever that is, right? There are positive aspects of stress, and this stress helps us to grow and develop. Then you have what we call tolerable stress, which is uncomfortable stress, which also helps us to grow. So maybe like some people would say planning a wedding is positive stress. Some people would say planning a wedding is uncomfortable stress. I would lean to the more uncomfortable side. The thing is, it's a stress, it's an intensity, but it's backed by support and rest and respite. It also generally has an end point, right?
Yes.
So you're maybe running a marathon can get stressful. It's uncomfortable, but it's tolerable, and the marathon will eventually end.
Yes.
So that's more of the uncomfortable stress. Even like in terms of for myself, like I'll just speak for myself. Medical school was a tolerable stress, right? And then residency for me specifically was a tolerable stress. It had an end point, and there were areas where I created respite, rest, and recovery. There are definitely training programs in the healthcare field that are toxic, and so they can lead into trauma, especially when they're longer term. But then you go into toxic stress. So toxic stress is when you don't have that respite, rest, and recovery, and you have this sort of ongoing stress. So the pandemic was one of those things. Like there was no end in sight. People are dying daily. There's not enough PPE. There's just like all kinds of things. Then there's the isolation, parents got their kids at home, not being able to go to work, some, working at home with young people and trying to manage that. And then comes the violence on the streets, and, the police violence, and then the Black Lives Matter movement, and the protesting, it just kept piling on. Like that becomes toxic for the system, right? And then what happens is, over time, toxic stress gets encoded into the body as trauma, right? So over time, so there are people who came out of there are many people who came out of the pandemic with trauma. That's and right. That is because of the prolonged toxic stress with no rest or recovery. And if you didn't create that, if you weren't able to create that respite, rest, and recovery in some kind of way, if you didn't have any support, then that encodes into your body as trauma. So that's the continuum.
End of life continuum. Tell us about that, please.
End of life continuum. Now that's a new terminology that I can't talk about. No, it isn't. The end of life continuum is not. I mean, I could talk about it, but it's not something that that's in my lexicon at the moment.
Here's why I want to ask you about that, because I know that you can answer this question. I did an interview. I was interviewed. I'm sorry. A friend of mine, her name is Portia Booker. She goes by Portia the Producer, and she had a radio show in Cleveland, Ohio, on station WOVU, and we talked about end of life care and decisions from a first responder perspective, because she had recently lost her mom. And I was working with her on some of the things that she was dealing with, because she was her POA and all that stuff, her health POA. And so we did a whole 1 hour interview, and I'll send this to you, talking about DNRs, DNIs, palliative care, hospital care, respite care, why it's important. What do I look for if I come on the scene and somebody's in cardiac arrest, And we're going to start working on that person immediately. And if somebody comes and say, oh no, they got a DNR, okay, while you're looking for it, we're going to keep working. And once you get it to me, I'm going to check and make sure all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. And if they're not, we're going to keep working, and you have to understand that that's part of our protocols. And I talked about in detail, what do you do in this situation as a caregiver, as a spouse, as whomever that's responsible, that held POA or POA? What do you do to prevent those things from happening where I don't have a DNR, but I don't want things done, or I don't want this person to be suffering anymore, and I really would like for you to stop doing what you're doing, but you don't have any paperwork to say one way or the other. So when I think of End of Life Continuum from a secondary trauma perspective, you're the perfect person to answer that, because as a family physician, I'm sure that you had patients who you lost.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that the term end of life continuum is not one that I'm familiar with. Mm-hmm. And, end of life care as it relates to trauma, I mean, of course. And I think there's a lot of different perspectives that I could share about that. So there's end of life care from the perspective of the caregiver, and then there's end of life, the continuum from the perspective of the first responder who shows up. And then there's end of life from the person who's experiencing the terminal illness as well. Right. So I'll since we're talking about secondary trauma, I will talk about it from the caregiver perspective. And what I'll say is that just from the primary person's perspective, there is always a discomfort with talking about one's own end of life. I think because we don't normalize that conversation. Right. And I've had several conversations with colleagues of mine, with friends of mine who are advocates for normalizing the conversation of end of life care, because the last thing you want is to leave your caregivers without the knowledge of what to do. Yes, that in and of itself can be very traumatic.
Oh yeah.
So when we talk about end of life care from a secondary, from a caregiver perspective, and the trauma that can occur from that, I think it's number one. I think it's a little bit more insidious, and that's why I said from the beginning that when we talk about caregiver trauma, that sometimes the caregiver it eludes the caregiver themselves, that they may be experiencing or they may be impacted by the caregiver experience.
Yes.
But when you have this space of having to take care of affairs and sort of like looking over your shoulder of when that moment is going to come, and then watching your loved one actually decline, all of that can be encoded in the body as trauma, and especially if in fact you yourself as a caregiver are not ready for that loss. Because there are people. Remember, trauma for one is not trauma for everyone.
That's right.
So the person who is the caregiver experience may not be traumatic for every person if they've gone through their own sort of anticipatory grief process, and there's a communication between the person who is terminal and the caregiver in such a way that while they'll grieve, it won't encode as trauma. If that makes sense.
Yes.
But then there are people who are actively resisting the potential loss or the inevitable loss, and the events around it, however the events get created, can it be encoded as trauma? So I think what I have to say about it specifically is, if you're in a caregiver situation, then it's useful to have support. Because again, when we talk about stress to trauma continuum, organizations and organizations out there that provide specifically respite for caregivers, 1 and 2 day respite if you just need to go get a hotel. Of course, if you need to, if you travel for work and you need to go travel for work, there are actual organizations that provide that. And so looking for those resources and also having on board a therapist. Absolutely having a therapist or a counselor on board so that you can process through what's happening and all of the stresses that are coming, because otherwise they just end up piling up and becoming toxic stress and the potential for lasting trauma.
Dr. Maiysha, you never cease to answer the question, compassion and advocacy and awareness. That's part of what I love about you, because you always bring it. And I love throwing curveballs at you because you still end up getting a base hit if you don't knock it out of the park. I'm a baseball fan from St. Louis. Go Cardinals. Okay. So I want to wrap up by asking you one more question. For you, what's the most important thing that you could say in closing to the audience about secondary trauma that you haven't talked about?
I won't say that what I have to say is something I haven't talked about, but it is something that I will reinforce because I believe that repetition is essential to learning. There are a couple of things that I'll say. Number one is just to remember that sometimes secondary trauma, the experience of secondary trauma can feel insidious, and it can sneak up on you if you're not aware. And so if you are in one of the positions that we talked about, if you're in a caregiver position, if you're in a first responder position, if you're a healthcare professional, if you're a law enforcement, if you're any of these, positions that we talked about, or if you're in a relationship or any kind of circumstance where, there's a repetitive ongoing stress, consider that, there could be the risk for the experience. If you find yourself caring for someone or having experienced multiple, caregiver by first responder incidents where all of a sudden you're not okay more often than not, consider trauma response. And if I have to leave you with anything, let's reach out for support.
Reach out for support. Okay.
Reach out for support, whether it's with a counselor, a therapist. Reach out to your organization if you have EAP.
Yes.
Speaking to organizations, leaders in organizations who might be listening, consider making mandatory these check-ins.
Yes.
EAP, consider creating policy inside of organizations that makes it mandatory for annual EAP, counseling check-ins for people who we know are constantly being exposed to violence and to death and end of life and all of these things, dangerous critical events, violent critical events. Consider having that be a mandatory. Seek help, seek counseling, normalize the conversation of trauma so that you can become trauma informed. And organizations, please make it priority and find budget to train your people around trauma and provide resources for them.
I want to share something on the screen before we close up. This is from First Responders First. This is their IG handles, first_responders_first. And on their IG, they posted, this was a couple of weeks ago, they posted this. This is a picture where it shows the number. It's 4 pictures. And in the center, it says 2023 suicides year to date reported through FIRST, which is the number one, sthelp.org. And this was reported as of July 7, 2023. Shows 4 pictures. Second picture has the number 6. Third picture has the number 46. And the fourth picture has number 11. 2. So far, 2 people who are emergency medical dispatchers or 911 operators have committed suicide. 6. So far this year, 6 paramedics and or EMTs have committed suicide so far this year. 46 police and 11 firefighters have committed suicides so far in 2023. And the caption reads, absolutely heartbreaking. We all must do so much more to end this crisis affecting all of our first responders. From retired Sergeant Michael Segru. And I thought about that and I was like, wow.
Yeah.
You don't hear about this stuff a lot in the media
Right.
or even in the news.
Right.
I get these breaking news stories all the time, but sometimes I miss some stories.
Right.
And when I thought about that, I said, I want to talk to Dr. Maiysha about that when we're talking about the secondary trauma. So, in closing, I'm going to go ahead and you can drop off for the missing person thing, but I wanted to say thank you so much for the work that you're doing as someone who is still in that foxhole, even though that you're not active in the hospital setting. You are part of the first responders that I consider, people think police, fire, EMS. I say first responders are more vast. You have military, you have in-hospital folks like yourself, and I can add, and I can go on and on and on. What I want to ask you is, what you got coming down the pike? What's next for you? Because I know we got a bunch of projects that we're working on.
Yes.
What do you have specifically going on?
Well, first of all, you and I, we're working on our TEDx talk that we're going to deliver together on stage. But I actually am excited because as I talk about, being trauma informed, trauma responsive, I am releasing within the next couple of weeks. We the last little bits of refinement of my trauma informed communication course. So it's called Communication That Transforms, and I'll share with you the link to that for the notes. But it is a course that's designed for the individual, but also for organizations who want to train their larger staff, their larger people, their executives, their leaders too, around what distinguishing what trauma informed it is, that trauma informed journey, but also the skills of communication that can prevent and mitigate harm in people as well. So you talk about, officers learning de-escalation. There are multiple components to that, but one of them is communication.
Okay.
And so the Communication That Transforms is a trauma-informed communication course, and that is launching by the 1st of August, 2023. And then, I'm always open and doing consulting work in the communication realm. I, of course, consulting in the anti-oppression, anti-racism realm, and equity, diversity, and inclusion. So as you can see, there's a podcast there coming down the pipeline, and then in about a few weeks from the time of this recording in July, you're going to see your very own LP coming to the Black Mind Garden podcast stage. So stay tuned for that as well.
I'm excited.
Yes, that's very exciting. But yeah, those are the things that I've got coming down. I'll talk about it more in the podcast. So you have, one action item, go subscribe and listen to the podcast, and then go check out the website, and you will find out more about the trauma informed communication course.
I'm going to have your link to your podcast as well as your link tree in the show notes for this episode. Dr. Maiysha Clairborne, it's a pleasure to always network and partner with you and have you in the house. I can't wait to meet you. Hopefully that'll be next month when I'm in Georgia for this firearms / stop the bleed training. And I'm looking forward to some more of these projects that we're working on, because I came up with a few more. So I don't think I got to end. I'm just, because I mind map, because I got a little ADD. So I'm always like, man, I think Dr. Maiysha can help me with this. Oh man, I think she'll be perfect on this particular topic, just to bring her in on that part. So I'm going to go ahead and let you go, because I'm getting ready to cover this missing person case. Yes. Again, peace and blessings be upon you. You deserve every flower, every petal, every accolade that is available to you, because you are a gentlewoman and a scholar. And I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for inviting me into this conversation. And I look forward to part 3 and part 2 on the Black Mind Garden podcast.
That's right.
All right. Take care.
Take care. All right. That's Dr. Maiysha Clairborne, MD, trauma-informed consultant, and also NLP trainer, as well as podcaster. Check her out on the Black Mind Garden podcast, streaming on Spotify, and I believe she's on a couple other platforms, but primarily Spotify, and I'll be on there very soon. So I want to move over to our next topic, which is the missing persons case. And you know what? I got a special thing for everybody, because not only are we going to cover a missing person case, we're going to cover two. We've done this before. So this is a brother and sister missing person case. And 99% of the cases, we cover are melanated folks. So these particular brothers and sisters, or brother and sister, are part of the Latinx community. They are Monica and Victor ARELLANO. ARELLANO, pardon me for jacking up the names. This is from thecharlieproject.org. I'm going to read their stories, and pretty much the information is about the same. So I want to start with Monica, because Monica's older. Monica ARELLANO, and that's ARELLANO, missing since July 26, 99. Now they both are missing on the same date, so that information is the same. Same city, Yuba City, California. Endangered missing, sex female, race Hispanic, according to Charlie Project. I'm just reading. Date of birth is April 10, 1992, which makes her 31. She was 7 years of age when she disappeared. Her height and weight, 4'6" 60 pounds. Distinguishing characteristics: Hispanic female, brown hair, brown eyes. And Victor, he was born February 28, 1997, and he's 26. He was 2 years old at the time he was missing. Height and weight, 2 feet 6 inches, 45 pounds. Hispanic male, brown hair, brown eyes. Starting with the details of Monica's disappearance. Monica was last seen at her home in Yuba City, California on July 26 of 99. She disappeared with her younger brother, Vic. Their mother, Blanca Alicia Dunas ARELLANO, was murdered in the bedroom of the family's home in the Park Terrace apartment complex in the 600 block of Queens Avenue. She had been stabbed multiple times with a butcher knife, which was left with the body. The prime suspect in Blanca's murder is her estranged husband, Francisco ARELLANO. He's the father of Monica and Victor, but isn't related to Blanca's other 3 children. He disappeared after the murder, and authorities believe he took Monica and Victor in range. The couple's relationship had been troubled. In August of 97, Francisco served 60 days in jail for spousal abuse. Blanca had gotten a restraining order against him that year, claiming he abused her an average of twice a year between April 91 and May of 97. She said he had threatened to kill her and take the children to Mexico. Francisco's birthday is September 17, 1971. He was 27 years old at the time. He was described as Hispanic, 5'7", 140 pounds, with brown hair, brown eyes, and black hair. Photos of him are unavailable. He may be driving a Chevrolet Monte Carlo. Based on Francisco's prior threats, investigators believe he and Monica and Victor may be in Mexico. The children's whereabouts are unknown, and their case remains unsolved. And the same information that I just read about Monica applies to Victor. So if you have any information about the whereabouts of either and both Victor and Monica ARELLANO, contact the Yuba City Police Department at 530-822-4661. Again, if you have any information about the whereabouts, good, bad, ugly, or indifferent, about Monica and Victor ARELLANO, contact the Yuba City Police Department, 530-822-4661. You can also find information on these children, or these who are adults now. You can find information from the California Attorney General's Office, the Appeal-Democrat, the Gridley Herald, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. These links will be attached to the link I'm going to provide for both of these individuals in the show notes. Again, I want to thank Dr. Maiysha Clairborne. I want to thank Dr. Maiysha Clairborne for joining us for part 2 of our primary, secondary, and vicarious traumas episode series, which will be airing this Thursday. July 20th will be the date for this episode to air. Take a first aid CPR class, stop the bleed, and make sure that you do everything anything that you can do to take care of yourself, because an emergency is going to happen. And I always say it's not a matter of if, but when and where a violent critical incident will happen. You need to be an immediate respondent to a first responder, shows LP out.